You did everything right and you made a budget and you stuck to it for a few weeks and you told yourself this time was different. And then something happened, maybe a bad day at work, or maybe a sale you could not ignore, or maybe you just got tired of saying no to yourself, and just like that the whole thing fell apart again. And here is the question most financial advice never asks. And what if the problem was never the plan? And what if the real problem was you, and not your discipline, and not your willpower, and not your income, but a set of invisible character traits operating quietly beneath every single financial decision you make, and traits so familiar they feel like personality, and traits so deeply wired into you that you have stopped noticing them entirely? About 1,000 years ago, a group of Jewish scholars began developing a system for something most people had never seriously attempted, and it was the deliberate structured examination of your own character, not to judge yourself and not to punish yourself, but to see yourself clearly, and then to change. And they called this system Mussar. And what it reveals about financial behavior is so precise and so uncomfortably accurate that it reads less like ancient wisdom and more like someone has been following you around with a notebook. And in this video we are going to look at 7 specific traits that Mussar identifies, and trace exactly how each one is quietly costing you money right now. And by the end you will not just understand what is happening, and you will see it in yourself clearly. And that is where everything changes. The word Mussar comes from the Hebrew root meaning instruction, or discipline, correction. And it was systematized in the 19th century by a Lithuanian rabbi named Israel Salanter, who believed that most human suffering, including financial suffering, was not caused by bad circumstances, and it was caused by unchecked character traits. And Salanter identified what he called middot character traits or soul qualities. And some of these traits in their healthy form are strengths, confidence, diligence, caution. But when unchecked, and when unexamined, and when allowed to run on autopilot for years, and the same traits become the invisible architecture of self-destruction. And this is not about being a bad person. And every single one of these traits exists in every human being, including the people who appear to have their finances completely together. And the difference is not the presence of the trait, and it is the awareness of it. And we are going to look at 7 of these traits today. And as we go through each one, I want you to pay attention not just intellectually, but personally. And because the ones that make you slightly uncomfortable are the ones that are costing you money right now. Pride, and the trait that keeps you stuck in silence. And trait 1, and gava, and pride, and the refusal to acknowledge where you actually are. Now meet Kevin. And Kevin was 41 years old and had not looked at his full financial picture in 3 years. And not because he was lazy, not because he did not care, but because looking felt like admitting something he was not ready to admit. And he had a good job, a nice car, the right neighborhood, and a private growing dread that the image he projected and the reality underneath it were moving further apart every month. Now Kevin's pride was not arrogance, it was armor. And like all armor, it protected him from something real, but it also made it impossible to move. Mussar identifies pride, gava, as one of the most financially destructive traits precisely because it masquerades as dignity. And it does not feel like pride, it feels like self-respect. And until you realize that self-respect has kept you from having a single honest conversation about money in the last 5 years. So how does pride show up in your finances? And you do not ask for help because asking feels like admitting failure. You do not negotiate your salary because negotiating feels presumptuous. You do not tell your partner the real numbers because the real numbers are embarrassing. And you do not consult a financial advisor because you feel like you should already know this. Now, every one of these silences has a financial cost. The question you did not ask cost you thousands in interest. The salary you did not negotiate cost you years of compounding income. And the conversation you did not have cost your household the ability to make a real plan together. So what is the Mussar practice here? See, Mussar does not ask you to become humble in some abstract spiritual sense. And it asks you to perform one small act of acknowledged reality per week. And for Kevin, the practice was simple. And one afternoon a month, he sat down with every financial statement he owned and read them all, and without looking away. And he called it his honesty hour, and he said the first time he did it he felt sick, the second time he felt clear, and the third time he made his first real financial plan. So pride is not conquered by becoming small, it is redirected towards something more honest. Real pride is knowing your numbers. And because people who know their numbers are harder to deceive, including by themselves. Trait 2. Cause. And anger. Emotional decisions made in the heat of feeling. Meet Priya. Priya had a rule: no impulse purchases over $50. She kept it almost perfectly. And except after hard days at work, or after her manager dismissed her idea in front of the team, or after a meeting where she felt invisible, and after one of those afternoons that left her vibrating with a feeling she could not quite name. On those days the rule disappeared, and in its place came something that felt, and for about 20 minutes, like relief. She called it retail therapy. Mussar calls it cause. Anger, and finding a financial exit. Now, anger is the most expensive emotion most people carry because it does not just drive impulse spending, and it drives financial decisions made in entirely the wrong emotional state. So here is how anger shows up in your finances. The revenge purchase, spending money to feel powerful after feeling powerless. The panic sell, watching your investments drop and selling in fury and fear rather than strategy. The overcommitment, saying yes to a bad business deal in a moment of wounded ego because backing down feels like losing. And the undercharge, pricing your work too low because negotiating firmly feels aggressive and you have learned to swallow that particular anger. Now, none of these feel like anger in the moment, they feel like decisions. But trace them back and you will find a feeling underneath every single one. So what is the Mussar practice here? See, Salanter taught that anger does not need to be eliminated. It needs to be delayed. He called this the pause, the deliberate insertion of time between the feeling and the financial response. And Priya began tracking her emotional state before any non-essential purchase over $30. Not judging it, just noting it. She wrote one word in a small notebook, and calm, and stressed, and angry, and sad, and celebrating. And within 60 days she had a map of her emotional spending that was more revealing than any bank statement. And once you can see the map, you can choose a different route. Impatience, the wealth killer that wears the costume of ambition. And trait 3, and zrizit, and impatience, and demanding results before the process has had time to work. Now meet Daniel. And Daniel had abandoned 4 savings plans, 3 investment strategies, and 2 small businesses in the last 7 years. Not because they were bad ideas, every single one of them was reasonable. But around the 3-month mark of each one the same thing happened. The results did not match the expectation. And the expectation was always, by now I should be further along. Now Mussar identifies impatience not as a minor inconvenience but as a fundamental distortion of reality. It makes you evaluate a process at the wrong moment, and before it has had time to compound, and before the quiet work of consistency has had a chance to surface. So here is how impatience shows up in your finances. And abandoning index funds after one bad quarter. and chasing the next investment trend because the current one is too slow, and starting a business, seeing no profit in month 2, and concluding the idea does not work, and switching banks, platforms, advisors, strategies, and systems before any of them have had time to prove themselves. Now, impatience costs compound interest, literally. And every time you abandon a compound process early, you are not just losing future returns. You are resetting the clock entirely. Back to zero, and again. So what is the Mussar practice here? And the Mussar antidote to impatience is not patience in the passive sense. It is building what Salanter called a long memory. And Daniel began keeping a one-page financial journal, not tracking numbers, but tracking decisions. And every time he felt the urge to abandon something, he wrote it down instead of acting on it. He wrote what I want to quit, why I want to quit it, what I expected by now, and what was actually promised by now. Now, the gap between those last 2 columns was almost always the entire story. He had not been promised results yet, and he had promised himself results on a timeline he had invented. And seeing that in writing 3 times in a row changed the pattern permanently. Envy. The financial black hole with a social media feed. Trait 4. An ayin hara. And envy. And measuring your wealth by what others appear to have. Now meet Jacob. And Jacob and his wife lived comfortably, not extravagantly, but comfortably. And until his colleague bought a new car. And Jacob had not needed a new car. His car was 3 years old and reliable. But for the next 2 weeks, every time he drove to work, the car felt like a statement about him. He upgraded 6 weeks later. The monthly payment was manageable. But the opportunity cost, what that money could have done in an index fund over 15 years, was not something he thought about on the day he signed. Now envy, and ayin hara, is the only character trait that generates zero pleasure from its own success. It only generates pain from someone else's. And in an era of curated social media wealth displays, it has become possibly the most expensive character trait a person can carry unchecked. So here is how envy shows up in your finances. And lifestyle inflation triggered not by your own needs but by what you see around you. And purchases made to close a perceived status gap that only exists in your perception. And avoiding investment conversations because other people seem to know more and that gap feels intolerable. And undervaluing your own financial progress because the benchmark you are measuring against is someone else's highlight reel. So what is the Mussar practice here? See, Mussar does not ask you to stop noticing what others have. It asks you to notice what the noticing does to you. And Jacob began a simple practice. And whenever he felt the pull of comparison, he wrote his own number down. And net worth this month, not compared to anyone, just his number. And beside it the same number from 6 months ago. Now the only comparison that heals envy is the comparison between who you were and who you are becoming. And everything else is noise designed to sell you something. Fear. The paralysis that looks like prudence. And trait 5. And pakad. Fear. Financial avoidance disguised as caution. Now meet Grace. And Grace had not opened her bank statements in 4 months. And not because she was careless, because she was terrified. The opening of an envelope had come to feel like the opening of a verdict. She paid her bills. She showed up to work. And by most external measures she was managing. But inside the avoidance was a growing pressure, a background dread so familiar she had stopped recognizing it as fear. And she called it stress, Mussar calls it pakad. And fear that has stopped being a warning signal and become a permanent address. So here is how fear shows up in your finances. And not opening bank statements, credit reports, or financial summaries, and avoiding conversations about wills, insurance, and estate planning because they feel morbid, and never starting to invest because the learning curve feels overwhelming, and overwhelming feels like danger, and keeping all savings in cash because markets feel unpredictable, and unpredictable feels catastrophic. And fear's greatest trick is that it disguises itself as wisdom, and caution sounds like prudence, and avoidance sounds like patience, and paralysis sounds like waiting for the right moment. But the right moment never arrives, and because fear does not wait for the right moment, it waits forever. So what is the Mussar practice here? And Mussar does not ask you to become fearless, and that is not a human option, and it asks you to act in the presence of fear, consistently in small doses. And Grace started with the smallest possible action. And one envelope, one statement every Tuesday morning before work with a cup of tea in good light. And she was not required to feel calm, she was only required to open it. And the feeling that followed the opening was never as bad as the feeling that came before it. And it never is, but you have to open enough envelopes to know that in your body, not just your head. And Grace opened 57 envelopes over 14 weeks. And by week 10, the stack on her kitchen table had stopped growing. Trait 6. And a slut. And laziness. Postponing financial decisions past the point where they still matter. Now meet James. And James had been meaning to update his will for 6 years. He had also been meaning to increase his retirement contribution, review his insurance coverage, and consolidate 2 old pension accounts from jobs he left in his 30s. None of it was difficult, all of it was slightly inconvenient. And slightly inconvenient, when combined with a busy life and no immediate consequence, has a way of becoming permanently deferred. And Mussar identifies this pattern as its slut. Not laziness in the casual sense, but the specific tendency to postpone high-leverage decisions because their consequences are invisible in the present. The will does not feel urgent because nobody has died yet, and the pension consolidation does not feel urgent because the money is technically still there, and the insurance review does not feel urgent because nothing bad has happened yet. So here is how laziness shows up in your finances. The 6-year-old will that has not been updated since you had children, and the automatic payment you set up and never reviewed for a plan you no longer need, the high-interest savings account you have been meaning to open since rates went up, the tax deductions you leave on the table every year because the paperwork feels like too much. The financial laziness is invisible in the short term and catastrophic in the long term. Every one of these deferrals is a quiet transfer of money away from your future self towards someone else's pocket. The insurance company that charges you more because you never switched, and the tax authority that keeps what you never claimed, and the estate that ends up in probate because the paperwork never got done. So what is the Mussar practice here? And Salanter taught that the antidote to its slut is not motivation, and motivation is unreliable. And the antidote is structure, specifically the scheduled inconvenience. And James blocked the first Saturday of every quarter in his calendar. For 4 hours, and no agenda except one category of financial admin. And first quarter, legal documents and will, the power of attorney, beneficiary updates. The second quarter, insurance and all policies reviewed, compared, adjusted. The third quarter, accounts and old pensions and dormant accounts, subscriptions. The fourth quarter, tax and all deductions gathered, an advisor booked, and paperwork done. And in 2 years, James did more financial maintenance than in the previous 12. And not because he became a different person, but because he stopped waiting to feel like doing it. Self-deception, the most expensive story you tell yourself. And trait 7. And Sheker, dishonesty. The financial stories we tell ourselves that we know are not quite true. Now meet Claire. And Claire described herself as good with money. She had a budget, she had a savings account, she had a general sense of where things stood. The budget had several categories marked as estimates, the savings account had not grown in 2 years, and the general sense of where things stood had never been verified by an actual review. And Claire was not lying to herself deliberately. She was doing something more subtle, and she was maintaining a story about herself that was comfortable, mostly accurate, and did not require her to look too closely. And Mussar identifies this as sheker, not outright dishonesty, but the small daily distortions we introduce into our self-narrative to avoid the discomfort of complete clarity, and the amount we round down in our heads when we describe our debt, and the income increase we promise ourselves is coming when we make financial commitments, and the savings rate we believe we have versus the savings rate we can verify we actually have. So here is how self-deception shows up in your finances. And saying you have a budget when you have a general idea, and saying you are investing when you are technically enrolled in a plan you have not reviewed in 4 years, and saying the debt is manageable when manageable means you make the minimum payment, and saying you will start seriously saving when things settle down and things have not settled down in a decade. And self-deception is uniquely dangerous because it blocks the feedback loop, and honest failure is fixable, you can see what went wrong and correct it, and comfortable self-deception removes your ability to see what is wrong at all. You cannot solve a problem you have convinced yourself does not exist. So what is the Mussar practice here? And the Mussar practice for sheker is called cheshbon hanefesh, and an accounting of the soul. But practically, it is just an accounting. And Claire began ending every month by writing down 3 numbers with no rounding and no qualifying language. What came in, what went out, what is left. And then 1 sentence, true or false, my financial life is moving in the direction I say I want it to move. And the sentence is either true or false. Not mostly true, not in some ways, not considering everything, true or false. And the first month she wrote it, Claire wrote false. And that single honest word was more useful than 3 years of comfortable approximation. We started this video with a mirror. And here is what Mussar ultimately teaches about that mirror. And most people approach their finances the way they approach a bathroom mirror on a difficult morning. They glance, they adjust what is adjustable, and they move on before they have to see too much. And the 7 traits we have walked through today are not character flaws in the moral sense. They are patterns, human, understandable, universal patterns, pride, anger, impatience, envy, fear, laziness, self-deception. Every person reading or listening to this carries at least 3 of them actively right now. And the question Mussar asks is not whether you have them. The question is whether you are willing to see them. And because once you can see a pattern clearly, it loses most of its power. Not all of it, these are not diseases that get cured. And they are tendencies that get managed and then redirected and over time transformed into something that actually serves you. And Kevin opened his statements. And Priya started tracking her emotional state before spending. And Daniel stopped quitting at month 3. And Jacob started measuring himself against his own past self instead of his neighbor's present. And Grace opened her first envelope on a Tuesday morning with a cup of tea. And James blocked the first Saturday of every quarter. And Claire wrote the word false, and then began the slow work of making it true. And none of them became different people. And they became clearer versions of the people they already were. And clarity, it turns out, is worth far more than any financial strategy you will ever read about. Before you go, one more thing. And we have now covered 2 ancient frameworks, and the 777 cycle of rhythm, and the Mussar mirror of character. And the 3rd framework in this series looks at something neither of those touches. It is not about how you behave with money, it is about how money flows between people. And it is a 2,000-year-old system of economic relationships built around a single idea that almost no modern financial advisor will ever tell you. And that who you do business with, who you lend to, who you borrow from, and how you structure your obligations to other people is not a soft consideration. And it is your most important financial decision. And that video goes live next week. And make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it.